Next, let's talk about some of the query components in more detail. First is key figures. There are actually three types of key figures that we can use. One is the basic, which is your regular key figures. That we will talk more about in a separate chapter. But we have also talked about a key figure. Basically, is a number that is important that we want to track. Okay. But in addition to basic key figures, we have also restricted key figures as well as calculated key figures. Okay, which we'll talk more about on the next two slides. Restricted key figures, we can define them based on a characteristic. Okay, so basically we define selections on the info provider, and define the restricted key figures can then be shared by all queries. In other words, once a restricted key figure is defined in your query and it is saved to the server, it will be available to all users in the future. Okay, so advantage of reuse, in other words. Example here of a restricted key figure is that we can define a net sales key figure that is restricted because it has only net sales from one country, okay, Mexico, as opposed to different countries that the company has operated. A calculated key figure can also be defined, which then involves some kind of formulas. Okay, and again, a calculated key figures can be defined once, and then it can be shared by all queries. Example here is that we can define a calculated key figure as unit sales price. So, what is a unit sales price? It is net sales divided by quantity. Okay, so the formula that you see there should be entered like that to the query designer, so that we have a calculated key figure defined properly. And also for calculated key figures, additional property that we can define is how should they be aggregated. Okay. Aggregation basically means, when we roll up a report. Okay, now remember, this is the opposite of drill down. Okay, with drill down, you get into more detail. With roll up, you hide the details. Okay, so when we roll up from monthly sales to yearly sales, for instance. Okay, so for instance, originally you have 12 months sales figures displayed, and now if you just want to display the yearly sales, so how do you aggregate the sales numbers? Now, standard aggregation includes a summary or sum, maximum, minimum, and so on. Okay, in most cases we will use the sum because when you aggregate monthly sales, we should add up the sales figures, right? To create yearly sale. Yearly sale is the sum of monthly sales. On the other hand, certain key figures may require exceptional handling. Okay, so if that's the case, we want to define exception aggregation. So instead of a sum, we may want to use the average or the count and so on. Other functions when we aggregate certain key figures. Okay, a review question on key figures. Next component is variables that we can define for our queries. Variables allow basically parameterization of queries. What does that mean? Basically, it means that we can run a query with certain variables or parameters so that the query can be reused. Okay. Now, for those of you who have used database products such as Access or Oracle and so on, you might have used a parameter query before, in which basically a query is defined with certain parameters or variables. And again, the purpose is to reuse the query. Okay. Now, an example that I can think of is that all public companies in the U.S. are required to report their earnings or produce financial results every 3 months, right? So you need to produce financial reports every 3 months. So you can create a query to get all the financial data to be displayed in your reports every 3 months. Okay, so you will do this basically 4 times a year. But the question is, do you want to create 4 separate queries? One for Q1 and one for Q2 and another one for Q3 and so on. Or do you just want to create one query which can be run 4 times, and each time with a different quarter? Okay, and most people would choose to define just one query, and then they define a variable or parameter which is the current quarter. So when the query is run, we can input the quarter number. Okay, let's say Q1 or Q2, Q3, and so on, and then the query will return the proper result based on whatever quarter number that was input. Okay, so that's the use of variables in your queries. And again, variables, once they are defined, they are available to all queries, so they can be reused. And there are 5 types of variables, in fact, in SAP BW, and also 5 processing types. The 5 different types of variables are shown here. The first is characteristic variable, which is, by the way, a most common one, so we'll spend more time talking about characteristics variables. In fact, the example that I just talked about can involve a characteristic variable, which is quarter, so that when we run the query, we can then input the quarter number, whether it's Q1, Q2, and so on. Okay, but there are also other variables, other types of variables, and each type of variables has certain processing methods, which are displayed on the next slide. Variable processing types. Now, in the book, they have actually a very detailed discussion on the different types of processing. I won't get into detail here, and actually, I don't require you to remember all the details here, because to me it's a little bit technical. One processing type I like to talk more about, though, is the first one, okay, which is user entry / default value, which is available to all types of variables, which is also the most common type of processing. Okay, and that means that when the query is run, we need to, the user needs to enter something. Okay, going back to my example, the user will enter the quarter number. Okay, again, Q1 or Q2 or Q3, whatever. Then the query will take that value and retrieve the data based on the proper quarter. Okay. Well, in fact, actually, I want to talk about the second type a little bit as well, because the book actually has an excellent example for a replacement path processing type. Figure 921. Okay, on page 402. Replacement path can be used when our query is a little bit more involved. In that particular example, figure 921, for instance, if your query is the one at the top, query 1, which says we want to find customers who are buying our top 10 materials. Okay. Again, we're trying to find customers who are buying our most popular products or materials. Okay, top 10 materials. Okay, but notice that the top 10 materials or top 10 products are not static, right? Because they can change depending on the time frame you're talking about. Because our business is dynamic, so the results of top 10 materials can vary from time to time. So we don't know beforehand what the top 10 materials are. Therefore, we need a second query to get the top 10 materials before we can get the results from query 1, who are the customers buying those top 10 materials. Okay, so if that's the case, then for query 1, we can define a replacement path which points to query 2. So whenever query 1 is executed, BW will then execute query 2 behind the scenes to return the top 10 materials, and then use those top 10 materials to find the corresponding customers. Okay, so it's kind of like a two-step process. It is more involved. Then we can use replacement path as the processing type for the first query. All right. Again, the book has very detailed discussions on each processing type. For those of you who are interested in learning about the details, if not, then don't worry too much about the technical details there. I do want to go over a simple example which you will practice in your assignment. Okay, that is to create a characteristic variable on the next slide, which has several steps. They are very straightforward actually. First, you open the variable editor from the info provider area, or you can use the characteristic restrictions. You just right click on a particular characteristic. For instance, a material group, if you want to create a variable on that, and then you define the processing type. For instance, for the assignment, you would select manual input default value. Okay, in other words, we are saying that the material group for the query will be input by the user when the query is run. Okay, so when the query is executed, you will get an input box into which you will type in a material group. So you type in the data at that time, and then the query is run, and so on. Okay. And you can also set the variable to whether it's ready for input or not, and then you can define it whether it's optional or mandatory. Okay, so just follow the instructions in the book, then you can define a variable very easily. But again, like I mentioned, that the process is simple, but if you want to learn more about the different types of variables or different types of processing for the various types of variables, you can read the book. Okay.